Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we dive into today's case, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below and tell me your location, city, state, or country, what time it is where you are. Are you watching this over morning coffee in New York? During your lunch break in London? Late at night in Australia? Let me know. I love seeing how our true crime community spans the entire globe. Let's build a map of where our community is. Comment below. Settle in comfortably. Let your breathing slow. This is a story from our present day, unfolding in the small communities of northern Michigan, where trust was shattered and a family's darkest secrets came to light. Asterisk. November in northern Michigan is a liminal time, caught between the brilliant colors of autumn and the first snows of winter. The forests are quiet, the tourist season long over, and the small towns that the landscapes settle into the rhythm of year-round life. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where communities are tight-knit, and where tragedy, when it strikes, reverberates through every household. Rebecca Park was 22 years old in November 2024. She was 9 months pregnant, just 2 weeks away from her due date. She already had 2 young sons, ages 2 and 3, and she was excited about welcoming her third child. Those who knew her described her as a loving mother, someone who had overcome a difficult childhood to build a life for herself and her children. Rebecca's childhood had been troubled. She and her siblings had been removed from their biological mother's care when Rebecca was young. They had been placed in foster care with Stephanie Park, who eventually adopted them. Stephanie would later say that she had hidden those kids from her for 18 years, knowing that their biological mother, Courtney Bartholomew, was dangerous. But when Rebecca turned 18, she made a decision that would ultimately cost her everything. She reconnected with Courtney, her biological mother, and Courtney's husband, Brad Bartholomew. Perhaps she hoped for reconciliation, for the mother-daughter relationship she had never really had. Perhaps she simply wanted to give her biological family another chance. On November 3rd, 2024, Rebecca Park was last seen getting into a vehicle. She had told friends and family that she was going to visit Courtney and Brad at their home in Boone Township, Wexford County. It was supposed to be a brief visit. She never came home. When Rebecca didn't return that evening, concern grew quickly. This wasn't like her. She was a dedicated mother who would never voluntarily leave her young sons. Her adoptive mother, Stephanie Park, knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The search for Rebecca Park began within hours of her disappearance. Local law enforcement, volunteers from the community, and Rebecca's family scoured the area. They posted flyers, organized search parties, and pleaded on social media for any information about Rebecca's whereabouts. The days turned into a week, then 2 weeks. The temperature dropped, the first snows came, and Rebecca Park remained missing. The community of northern Michigan came together in those weeks in November. Volunteers walked through forests and fields, calling Rebecca's name. They checked abandoned buildings, searched along roadways, and followed every possible lead. The case gained attention on social media, with thousands sharing Rebecca's photo and information about her disappearance. Rebecca's adoptive mother, Stephanie, was relentless in her efforts to find her daughter. She organized search parties, spoke to media outlets, and refused to give up hope. But beneath that hope was a growing fear, a terrible suspicion that she tried not to voice but couldn't entirely suppress. Law enforcement was investigating Courtney and Brad Bartholomew from the beginning. They were, after all, the last people known to have seen Rebecca. But without evidence, without a body, there was little they could do beyond questioning and surveillance. Courtney Bartholomew, 40 years old, had a complicated history. She had lost custody of her children years before, and those who knew the family understood why. She had struggled with various issues, and the state had determined that she was unfit to care for her children. When Rebecca reconnected with her as an adult, some of Rebecca's family members had worried, but Rebecca had been hopeful about the relationship. Brad Bartholomew, 47, was Courtney's husband. He worked odd jobs and kept a low profile in the community. Neighbors would later say they seemed like an ordinary couple, Nothing that would suggest they were capable of the horror that investigators would eventually uncover. As the search continued, Rebecca's sister Kimberly Park and Kimberly's fiancé Richard Lee Fowler were also being questioned by police. Their behavior had raised suspicions. They seemed nervous, evasive, and their stories didn't quite add up. Investigators began to suspect that they knew more than they were saying. The days grew colder. Thanksgiving came and went. Rebecca's due date passed. Her baby, who should have been born into loving arms, would never take a breath. And then, on November 25, 2024, volunteer searchers made a discovery in the Manistee National Forest. The Manistee National Forest stretches across northern Michigan, a vast expanse of pine and hardwood trees, rolling hills, and quiet solitude. It's a place where people go to hunt, to hike, to find peace in nature. On November 25th, it became the site of an unspeakable tragedy. Volunteer searchers, combing through a remote section of the forest, found human remains. The location was isolated, far from any main roads or trails, the kind of place someone might choose if they wanted to hide something they never wanted found. Law enforcement was called immediately. The area was cordoned off. Medical examiners were brought in, and the terrible work of identification began. It didn't take long to confirm what everyone had feared. The remains were those of Rebecca Park. She had been dead for weeks, hidden in the forest while her family searched desperately for her. The baby she had been carrying was gone too. Both mother and child lost to an act of violence that investigators were only beginning to understand. The autopsy would later reveal the full horror of what had happened to Rebecca. But even in those first hours after the discovery, it was clear that she had not died peacefully or accidentally. This was murder, brutal and intentional. The investigation shifted immediately. What had been a missing persons case was now a homicide investigation. And the focus turned sharply to Courtney and Brad Bartholomew. Law enforcement worked around the clock, building their case. They re-interviewed witnesses, collected evidence, and pieced together the timeline of Rebecca's last day. What they uncovered was a crime so disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that it shocked even veteran investigators who had seen the worst that humanity could offer. On November 30th, 2024, 5 days after Rebecca's body was found, police arrived at the Bartholomew home in Boone Township. Courtney Bartholomew, age 40, and Brad Bartholomew, age 47, were arrested and taken into custody. The charges would be announced soon after, and they would paint a picture of a crime that defied comprehension. On December 2nd, 2024, Courtney and Brad Bartholomew appeared before Judge Corey Wiggins in the 84th District Court for their arraignment. The courtroom was packed with members of the community, reporters, and Rebecca's grieving family members. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with anger and sorrow. The prosecutor read the charges. Each of the Bartholomews faced 8 counts, and each count represented another layer of the horror that Rebecca had endured in her final hours. First-degree murder, the intentional and premeditated killing of Rebecca Park. Felony murder, killing that occurred during the commission of another felony. Torture, the crime that perhaps best captured the true nature of what had happened. According to the charges, Courtney and Brad Bartholomew had not simply killed Rebecca. They had tortured her. They had caused her prolonged pain and suffering before she died. Conspiracy to commit torture. They had planned this together, worked together to carry it out. Assault on a pregnant individual causing miscarriage or stillbirth. They had known Rebecca was pregnant. They had known she was carrying their grandchild, a baby just 2 weeks from being born. And their actions had killed that baby too. Conspiracy to commit assault on a pregnant individual. Again, the planning, the working together to destroy not just one life but 2. Unlawful imprisonment. They had held Rebecca against her will in their home, preventing her from escaping or calling for help. And finally, removal of a dead body. After they had killed her, they had taken her body to the Manistee National Forest and hidden it, trying to conceal their crime. But it was the allegation that emerged about their motive that truly made the crime incomprehensible. According to investigators, Courtney and Brad Bartholomew had lured Rebecca to their home with a specific purpose. They had allegedly attempted to forcibly remove the baby from Rebecca's womb. They wanted the child, but they didn't want Rebecca. And in their attempt to take the baby, they had killed both mother and child. The judge ordered both Courtney and Brad held without bond. They were prohibited from communicating with each other while in jail. They would remain in custody as the case moved forward through the court system. Each of the murder charges carried a potential sentence of life in prison. If convicted, Courtney and Brad Bartholomew would likely spend the rest of their lives behind bars. As the case against Courtney and Brad Bartholomew moved forward, investigators continued to pursue other individuals who they believed had knowledge of the crime or had helped to cover it up. Rebecca's biological sister, Kimberly Park, and Kimberly's fiancé, Richard Lee Fowler, were arrested and charged with their own set of crimes. The charges against them included tampering with evidence, lying to police during the investigation, and filing false reports. While Kimberly and Richard were not accused of participating in Rebecca's murder, prosecutors alleged that they had known what happened or had learned about it afterward, and had taken steps to help Courtney and Brad avoid detection. The exact nature of their involvement remained unclear, but their charges suggested they had actively obstructed the investigation. The question that haunted everyone who knew the family was, how could a sister betray another sister so completely? How could family members participate in or cover up such a heinous crime? The dynamics within the biological family were clearly toxic and deeply troubled. Rebecca had been removed from Courtney's care as a child for good reason. When she had reconnected with her biological mother as an adult, perhaps she had hoped that Courtney had changed, that there could be a relationship there worth having. Instead, she had walked into a trap. The people who should have protected her, who should have welcomed her and her unborn child with love, had instead seen her pregnancy as an opportunity to take what they wanted and discard the rest. The small communities of northern Michigan were devastated by Rebecca's murder. Vigils were held in her memory. People who had never met her wept at the senselessness of her death and the death of her unborn child. Stephanie Park, Rebecca's adoptive mother, spoke to the media about the daughter she had lost. She talked about the years she had spent protecting Rebecca and her siblings from their biological mother, only to have Rebecca reconnect with Courtney as an adult. She expressed both grief and frustration, the agony of a mother who had tried to keep her child safe and had failed. But Stephanie also spoke about Rebecca's two surviving sons, ages 2 and 3. The boys had lost their mother, but they would not lose their family. Stephanie was in the process of adopting them, ensuring that they would be raised with love and stability, just as she had raised Rebecca. It was a small light in an otherwise dark story. 2 little boys who would grow up without their mother, but who would know that they were wanted, that they were loved, and that their mother had been loved too. The community rallied around the family, raising money to help with funeral expenses and to support the boys. Strangers donated to funds set up in Rebecca's name. People who had participated in the search for Rebecca came to her memorial service, needing to say goodbye to the young woman they had tried so hard to find alive. There was also anger in the community, anger at Courtney and Brad Bartholomew, anger at Kimberly Park and Richard Fowler, anger at a system that had allowed Rebecca to be in danger. People demanded justice, demanded that those responsible be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. As December 2024 drew to a close, the case against Courtney and Brad Bartholomew was still in its early stages. They had been arraigned, charged, and ordered held without bond, but the actual trial was likely months or even years away. The legal process in murder cases is lengthy and complex. There would be preliminary hearings to determine if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. There would be motions filed by defense attorneys, attempts to suppress evidence or challenge the charges. There would be jury selection, the trial itself, and if there were convictions, sentencing hearings. Throughout all of this, Rebecca's family would have to relive her death again and again. They would have to sit in courtrooms and hear the details of what was done to her. They would have to face Courtney and Brad, the people who had destroyed their family. The evidence against the Bartholomews appeared to be substantial. The fact that Rebecca was last seen going to their home, combined with the forensic evidence that would be gathered from the crime scene and Rebecca's body, would likely form the basis of the prosecution's case. There might be cell phone records, surveillance footage, witness testimony. The modern tools of criminal investigation would all be brought to bear. But even the strongest cases can face challenges in court. Defense attorneys would argue reasonable doubt, would challenge the prosecution's narrative, would try to save their clients from life sentences. The trial, when it came, would be hard-fought on both sides. For Rebecca's family, there could be no real justice. Justice would mean Rebecca was still alive, raising her 3 children, living the life she should have had. Justice would mean her baby had been born healthy and was growing up loved. But that was impossible now. The best they could hope for was accountability. They could hope that Courtney and Brad Bartholomew would be convicted and would spend the rest of their lives in prison. They could hope that the truth would be fully revealed, that every detail of what happened would be brought into the light. They could hope that Rebecca's story would serve as a warning about the dangers of reconnecting with abusive family members, about the importance of trusting one's instincts when something feels wrong. The Rebecca Park case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, about the bonds that are supposed to protect us, but can sometimes destroy us instead. We have a cultural narrative about family that emphasizes forgiveness, reconciliation, second chances. We're told that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, that we should always give our relatives another opportunity to be in our lives. But sometimes family is dangerous. Sometimes the people who share our DNA are the ones who pose the greatest threat to our safety and well-being. And sometimes second chances end in tragedy. Rebecca Park had been removed from her biological mother's care for a reason. The state had determined that Courtney Bartholomew was unfit to care for her children. Rebecca had been fortunate to be placed with Stephanie Park, an adoptive mother who loved her and protected her. But when Rebecca became an adult, she made the decision to reconnect with Courtney. It's impossible to know exactly what motivated that decision. Perhaps she wanted to understand where she came from. Perhaps she hoped that her biological mother had changed over the years. Perhaps she wanted her children to know their biological grandmother. Whatever her reasons, the decision cost her everything. This doesn't mean that reconciliation with estranged family members is always wrong or dangerous. Many people successfully rebuild relationships with parents or siblings from whom they were separated. Many people find healing and closure through such reunions. But Rebecca's case is a reminder that we must be cautious, that we must trust our instincts, and that we must prioritize our safety and the safety of our children above our hopes for what a family relationship could be. Stephanie Park had hidden her adopted children from their biological mother for 18 years because she knew Courtney was dangerous. When Rebecca reconnected with Courtney as an adult, Stephanie couldn't stop her. Rebecca was a grown woman, entitled to make her own choices. But those choices led to the outcome that Stephanie had feared. In all discussions of Rebecca Park's murder, we must not forget the other victim, her unborn baby, just 2 weeks from being born. The baby, whose gender and name were never publicly shared, died along with Rebecca. This child had been wanted, had been anticipated with joy by Rebecca and her family. Preparations had likely been made for the baby's arrival. Names had been chosen, place had been prepared. Instead, the baby died before taking a first breath, died in circumstances so horrific that they challenge our ability to comprehend how anyone could commit such an act. The charges against Courtney and Brad Bartholomew included assault on a pregnant individual causing miscarriage or stillbirth. This charge recognized the baby as a separate victim, acknowledged that the crime had claimed 2 lives, not 1. For Rebecca's 2 surviving sons, they lost not only their mother, but also the sibling they would never meet. As they grow older, they will learn about what happened, about the family they lost, and they will have to make sense of a tragedy that defies rational understanding. Stephanie Park, in adopting her grandsons, was ensuring that Rebecca's children would be raised with love. She was breaking the cycle of abuse and neglect that had characterized Courtney Bartholomew's parenting. The boys would grow up knowing that they were safe, that they were valued, and that their mother had loved them. It was a small redemption in a story that otherwise offered very little. Cases like Rebecca Park's force us to confront the concept of evil. What do we call people who would torture and murder a pregnant woman? What do we call a mother who would do this to her own daughter? What words are adequate to describe such an act? The crime alleged against Courtney and Brad Bartholomew is so far outside the bounds of normal human behavior that it challenges our ability to explain or understand it. Most people, even those capable of violence, even those with serious psychological issues, would not and could not do what they are accused of doing. To lure your own pregnant daughter to your home, to imprison her, to torture her in an attempt to remove her unborn child, and to kill both mother and baby in the process. This is an act of such profound moral depravity that it seems almost supernatural in its wrongness. But it's not supernatural. It's a human act committed by human beings who made choices at every step of the way. They chose to plan this crime. They chose to lure Rebecca to their home. They chose to carry out their plan even as she suffered. They chose to hide her body afterward. Every one of those choices was a moment when they could have stopped, could have changed course, could have decided that this was too far. And at every moment, they chose to continue. Understanding this doesn't require us to believe in supernatural evil or demonic possession. It simply requires us to acknowledge that some people are capable of acts that most of us can barely imagine, and that those acts cause real harm to real people who trusted them. Rebecca Park trusted her biological mother. She went to Courtney's home believing she would be safe there. That trust was betrayed in the most absolute way possible. As the winter of 2024 turned toward 2025, the legal proceedings in the Rebecca Park case continued to move forward slowly. Courtney and Brad Bartholomew remained in jail, held without bond. Kimberly Park and Richard Fowler faced their own court dates on charges of obstruction. The Michigan Attorney General's office was involved in the case, a sign of its complexity and seriousness. Prosecutors were building their case methodically, gathering every piece of evidence, preparing for every possible defense strategy. For Rebecca's family, life had to continue even in the midst of their grief. Stephanie Park was caring for her two young grandsons, helping them process the loss of their mother in age-appropriate ways. The boys were too young to fully understand what had happened, but they knew their mama was gone, and that absence would shape their childhood. The community of northern Michigan was also processing the trauma. When such a crime happens in a small community, it affects everyone. People lock their doors who never used to. They look at their neighbors with new suspicion. They hug their own children a little tighter. There were also broader conversations happening about the child welfare system, about how to protect children from dangerous parents, and about how to support adult children who want to reconnect with estranged family members. Rebecca's case became a touchstone for these discussions, a tragic example of what can happen when second chances are given to people who should never receive them. Some advocates called for programs that would help adults who are considering reconnecting with abusive parents to assess the risks and make informed decisions. Others argued for stricter monitoring of individuals who have lost custody of their children to prevent them from harming those children later in life. These were difficult conversations, involving complex questions about personal freedom, family rights, and state intervention. There were no easy answers, but Rebecca's death made it clear that the current approach was not sufficient to protect everyone. In the midst of all the legal proceedings, the discussions of policy, and the community trauma, it was important not to lose sight of who Rebecca Park actually was. She was not just a victim. She was not just a name in a court document or a tragedy in a news story. She was a real person, a 22-year-old woman with hopes and dreams, with people who loved her, with a life that mattered. Rebecca was a mother who loved her children. She was a daughter who had overcome a difficult childhood. She was a young woman who was trying to build a good life for herself and her family. Those who knew her remembered her smile, her dedication to her sons, her determination to be a better parent than the one she had been born to. She had broken the cycle in her own parenting, giving her children the love and stability she had not received from her biological mother. Rebecca had also been brave enough to reach out to Courtney, to try to build a relationship despite the difficult history. That bravery, that willingness to hope for something better, ultimately cost her life. But it also spoke to her character, to her capacity for forgiveness and her desire for connection. In the end, Rebecca Park deserved better than what she got. She deserved the chance to raise her 3 children. She deserved to see her baby be born and grow up. She deserved to have family members who would protect her, not destroy her. She deserved to live. The story of Rebecca Park does not have a neat ending because the story is still being written. As of December 2024, Courtney and Brad Bartholomew had not yet gone to trial. They had not been convicted. The full truth of what happened in their home on November 3rd had not yet been revealed in a courtroom. But the truth will come out eventually. Trials bring things into the light. Evidence is presented. Witnesses testify. And juries decide what happened and who is responsible. For Rebecca's family, that process will be painful but necessary. They need to know exactly what happened to Rebecca. They need to see those responsible held accountable. They need some sense of closure, even though true healing may take years or may never fully come. The case reminds us of several truths. It reminds us that family can be dangerous as well as loving. It reminds us that trust can be betrayed. It reminds us that evil exists, not as an abstract concept, but as concrete actions taken by real people. But it also reminds us of the capacity for love and resilience. It reminds us of communities that come together in tragedy. It reminds us of adoptive parents like Stephanie Park who give children the homes and love they deserve. It reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, there can be people who choose to protect and care for the vulnerable. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let the weight of this story settle gently. Let it remind you to cherish those who truly love you, to trust your instincts about dangerous people, and to protect the vulnerable, especially children. Rebecca Park's life mattered. Her story matters. And the two little boys she left behind will grow up knowing that their mother loved them, that she wanted better for them, and that she lives on in their memories and in the people who care for them now. May Rebecca and her unborn child rest in peace. And may justice, when it comes, be swift and complete. October 29, 2011. 2 nights before Halloween. The Farms Country Club in Dyersburg, Tennessee was alive with costumes, laughter, and music. Among the partygoers was 44-year-old Karen Swift, dressed as Catwoman. Her dark costume a striking contrast to her usually vibrant personality. But that night, something was different. Friends noticed she wasn't herself. She wasn't the life of the party like she usually was. She seemed distant, preoccupied. By the time midnight rolled around, Karen left the party with her friends Bill and Kathy Bona, planning to spend the night at their house. Then her phone rang. Her 9-year-old daughter Ashley was at a sleepover and wanted to come home. Karen, being the devoted mother everyone knew her to be, immediately went to pick her up. She drove Ashley home to their house on Willie Johnson Road in Dyersburg, arriving sometime after 2 a.m. Karen's husband David was waiting up. He later told police he briefly spoke to Karen when she got home. Mother and daughter went to bed together in the same room. When Ashley woke up the next morning, she was in a different room, and her mother was gone. Karen Swift would never be seen alive again. This is the story of what happened after the Halloween party. A story that has haunted a small Tennessee town for over 13 years. A story of control, jealousy, obsession, and murder. A story that, even after a trial and an acquittal, still has no final answers. I'm going to tell you everything we know about the disappearance and death of Karen Johnson Swift. Let me tell you about Karen. Because before she became a headline, before she became a case file, she was a woman, a mother, a friend, and an athlete. Karen Johnson was born on January 25, 1967, in Galesburg, Illinois. She was an honored track athlete in high school, and that love of running stayed with her throughout her life. As an adult, she regularly participated in 5 Burmese Chots and worked as a personal trainer and aerobics instructor at the YMCA in Dyersburg. Her specialty class was called Silver Sneakers, a fitness program for older adults. Everyone who worked with her said the same thing. Karen was energetic, passionate, and genuinely cared about helping people get healthy. As a worker and as a person, Karen Swift did wonderful things for the YMCA. Her boss Randy Butler would later say, but Karen wasn't just defined by her work. She was a mother of 4, 2 adult sons from a previous relationship, and 2 daughters with her husband David Swift. Friends described her as fun, energetic, and the life of the party. but also deeply devoted to her children. She showed up to every game, every dance competition. She was there. Karen and David Swift had been married since 1989, over 2 decades together. But it hadn't been an easy marriage. They had actually divorced once before, in 2000, only to remarry that same year. It was complicated. There had been affairs on both sides. There had been separations and reconciliations. By 2011, their relationship was hanging by a thread. And in the months leading up to that Halloween party, friends noticed changes in Karen. She was going out more, staying out later, drinking more than usual. She had developed a new social circle, friends who frequented the farm's country club, friends who enjoyed partying and living freely. Some people whispered about rumors of a swingers club called the Pink Poodle Club, though these rumors were never verified. David noticed the changes too. And according to testimony that would later come out in court, he didn't like them. Not one bit. Karen's friend Jennifer Guerin, a neighbor, testified that whenever Karen came over to her house, David would eventually show up, insisting that Karen go home with him. Another time, when Karen was having dinner at Applebee's with friends, David showed up uninvited. Amanda MacArthur testified that after Karen ran an errand one day, she noticed David's car in the parking lot. The behavior frightened her because she realized the things Karen had confided in her about David's controlling nature were true. Friends later described David as jealous, possessive, someone who spied on and stalked Karen. He called and texted her incessantly, as many as 25 times within a 30-minute period. He believed she was having an affair, possibly with their friends Bill or Kathy Bona. He told police he had caught Karen in bed with a naked Kathy, and on another occasion, found Karen at home with nothing but a towel on, alone with Bill Bona. By October 2011, Karen had had enough. On October 10, 2011, exactly 20 days before she disappeared, Karen filed for divorce. She requested custody of their 2 minor daughters, child support of $1,400 per month, permanent alimony, a share of David's upcoming work bonuses, approximately $25,000, and a division of marital assets. The paperwork was drafted. The process had begun. But Karen was still living in the house with David and their daughters, still navigating that impossible space between marriage and divorce, that limbo where everything is uncertain and emotions run high. On the morning of October 29th, the day of the Halloween party, David asked Karen to have dinner with him that evening. She said no. She rebuffed his attempt at reconciliation. Instead, she went to that Halloween party with Bill and Kathy Bona. And then she vanished. October 30th, 2011. David Swift woke up around 10 a.m. to find his wife missing. But he wasn't the first person to report her missing. That call came from Bill and Kathy Bona, Karen's friends who had been expecting her to return to their house after picking up Ashley. When police arrived at the Swift home on Willie Johnson Road, David was cooperative. He agreed to be interviewed without a lawyer present. He told investigators about the Halloween party, about Karen picking up Ashley, about briefly speaking to Karen when she arrived home after 2 a.m. But then David started talking about Karen's lifestyle, about her boozing and partying, about her sneaking out of the house at all hours, about how she was supposed to be at Walmart buying groceries but was really meeting Kathy Bona. He seemed obsessed with her behavior, unable to focus on anything else. Chief Investigator Terry McCrate later said, "That was just a sign to me that this guy is hiding something. He's covering something up." That same morning, 2 hunters discovered Karen's 2004 Nissan Murano abandoned on a rural roadside, just a quarter mile from her home. The driver's side door was locked. Inside the vehicle, investigators found her Halloween Catwoman costume. The car had a shredded tire, completely destroyed, as if someone had driven on it while it was flat. But there were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. No blood, no indication of violence. About 400 to 500 feet from the Swift home, investigators found both of Karen's cell phones. They had been smashed, destroyed deliberately. This was significant because Karen had 2 phones, one that David knew about and a second secret phone that she used to avoid being monitored by him. David told investigators he didn't know about the second phone. But here's where things get interesting. Investigators later discovered that the secret phone's number was programmed into David's work phone. He didn't know about it. He had lied. Cell phone records would later reveal a crucial timeline. Karen's phones showed activity at the Swift home between 2:08 a.m. and 4:38 a.m. At 5:04 a.m., her phone left the house and moved toward an area of interest. At 5:09 a.m., all activity stopped, completely, as if someone had turned off the phones or smashed them at that exact moment. A massive search operation began. Volunteers from the community, the Dyer County Sheriff's Office, Tennessee Highway Patrol, the Dyer County Rescue Squad, members of the Shelby County Sheriff's Department, and a THP helicopter, everyone mobilized to find Karen. The community of Dyersburg came together, hoping, praying that Karen would be found alive. Days passed, then weeks. On December 10th, 2011, 6 weeks after Karen disappeared, a caretaker discovered her body. She was found near Bledsoe Cemetery on Harness Road and Burnt Mill Road, about 3 miles from her home. Her remains were hidden beneath a tangle of vines and undergrowth, concealed so well that searchers had likely passed right by the location during the initial search efforts. Karen's body was too decomposed to be visually identified. Dental records confirmed it was her. The medical examiner's autopsy revealed the horrific truth. Karen had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The 17-page autopsy report, which was initially sealed by a judge and only released years later through an open records request, described a complex skull fracture that went from one side of her head to the other. The report suggested she may have been hit with a hammer or a similar object, a direct blow to the front of her head. There were no defensive wounds. This suggested Karen had been attacked suddenly, without warning, by someone she may have trusted. The autopsy also revealed that Karen was found wearing only a pair of black underwear that were pulled halfway down her thighs. She was too decomposed to determine if she had been sexually assaulted. Her death was ruled a homicide. A murder had occurred in Dyersburg, Tennessee. But who was responsible? In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, David Swift became a person of interest. The statistics are stark. When a married woman is murdered, the husband is statistically the most likely suspect. David was the last known person to see Karen alive. They were in the process of divorcing. There was evidence of controlling behavior, jealousy, stalking. But there was a problem. There was no forensic evidence linking David to the crime. No DNA, no blood, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no witnesses. Prosecutor Danny Goodman would later admit in court that the jury would not hear testimony about any forensic evidence linking David Swift to his wife's death. The case would have to be built entirely on circumstantial evidence. David's behavior, his lies, his motive, and the timeline. Investigators searched the Swift home. They seized David's laptop computer. What they found was revealing. Between October 31st and November 10th, 2011, the period after Karen disappeared, but before her body was found, David's laptop accessed Match.com and Adult Friend Finder a total of 175 times in private browsing mode under his password-protected account. His wife was missing, presumed dead, and David was on dating websites. Prosecutors would later argue this demonstrated both marital discord, motive, and consciousness of guilt. David was already moving on because he knew Karen wasn't coming back. There was also the matter of David's supposed leg injury. He showed up to the police station on crutches, claiming he had re-injured his knee after a surgery months prior. But a witness would later dispute this, suggesting the injury may have been exaggerated or faked. Despite all of this, investigators couldn't make an arrest. They didn't have enough. The district attorney's office reviewed thousands of pages of evidence, witness statements, phone records, forensic reports, surveillance footage, but couldn't build a strong enough case. Years passed. The case went cold. David Swift moved on with his life. In 2014, 3 years after Karen's death, he joined the Christian dating site Christian Mingle. He met a woman named Kelly Essman. They married in May 2016, but that marriage wouldn't last long. Kelly Essman would later speak exclusively to ABC's 2020. describing a relationship that turned dark. She said David was controlling, obsessive, and eventually began stalking her after they separated. She showed footage to investigators, security camera footage showing David in her backyard in the middle of the night, standing there watching her house. He had driven 40 minutes one way just to be there. In July 2023, David Swift was charged with felony stalking in Jefferson County, Alabama. Kelly Essman was granted a protection order. David had allegedly exhibited the same pattern of behavior with his second wife that he had with Karen: control, surveillance, obsession. But that stalking charge would not be admissible in David's murder trial. The jury would never hear about Kelly Essman or what she experienced. The judge ruled it was too prejudicial. Meanwhile, back in Tennessee, a private investigator named Heather Michelle Cohen began reviewing Karen's case in 2018. She was determined to find answers. Cohen dug into the evidence, interviewed witnesses, and stirred up what she called the hornet's nest in Dyersburg. Reporter Burton Staggs from the Tennessee River Valley News filed an open records request with the Tennessee State Medical Examiner's Office and received Karen's autopsy report, the document that had been sealed for years. His reporting brought renewed attention to the case. The pressure mounted. In February 2022, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation executed a search warrant at the former Swift residence. Investigators collected new evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and built their case. On August 8, 2022, more than 10 years after Karen's death, a Dyer County grand jury indicted David Swift for premeditated first-degree murder. David was arrested in Alabama with assistance from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. He was 56 years old, remarried, living a new life far away from Dyersburg. The community was stunned. Karen's daughter, Ashley, now 20 years old, was baffled. "I remember trying to figure out why," she told 20/20ths. "Why right now? Why, after all these years, is this happening?" David Swift pleaded not guilty. David Swift's trial began on May 28, 2024, in Weakley County Circuit Court in Dresden, Tennessee. Due to extensive pretrial publicity, the defense had successfully argued for a change of venue. The trial was moved about 50 miles northeast of Dyer County. Judge Mark Hayes presided. Prosecutor Danny Goodman led the state's case. Defense attorney Daniel Taylor represented David Swift. The trial lasted just over a week and featured dozens of witnesses, hundreds of pieces of evidence, and a community desperate for answers. Prosecutor Goodman laid out the state's theory in his opening statement. This was a case about control, rejection, and rage. David Swift was a man who could not accept that his wife was leaving him. Truly leaving him this time, not like before when they had divorced and remarried. Karen had filed for divorce. She had rejected his attempts at reconciliation. She was building a new life without him. And David, according to the prosecution, couldn't let that happen. The state's theory was this. After Karen arrived home with Ashley around 2 a.m. on October 30th, she took a sleep aid and fell asleep in bed with her daughter. At some point in the early morning hours, between 4:38 a.m. and 5:04 a.m., David moved Ashley to another room while she slept. He then dragged Karen from the bedroom to the garage. And there, prosecutors argued, David violently stomped on Karen's head, causing the complex skull fracture that killed her. He then loaded Karen's body into a vehicle, drove to Bledsoe Cemetery, and dumped her body in the overgrowth. He shredded the tire on her Nissan Murano, possibly by driving it on a screw that he manually inserted, and abandoned it near their home to make it look like she had car trouble and was abducted. He smashed both of her cell phones and threw them away from the house. Then he went home, moved Ashley back to the original room, and waited to be surprised when Karen was reported missing. To support this theory, prosecutors presented the timeline. Cell phone records showing Karen was home until 5:04 a.m. Then her phone left the house and all activity stopped at 5:09 a.m. The secret phone, evidence that David knew about Karen's second phone despite claiming he didn't. The number was programmed into his work phone. The voicemail call. Forensic extraction revealed that someone accessed Karen's secret phone hours after she went to bed and called the phone's voicemail. Who would do that? Someone looking for messages, trying to see who Karen had been in contact with. The tire. A tire technology expert testified that the screw found in Karen's tire was manually inserted. The tire's damage resulted from driving on the totally collapsed tire. Someone had deliberately sabotaged it. Multiple friends and neighbors testified about David's controlling, jealous, possessive behavior, his constant surveillance, his inability to let Karen have independence. The dating websites. Evidence that David accessed Match.com and Adult Friend Finder 175 times, while Karen was still officially missing and before her body was found. The lies? David's claim that he didn't know about the second phone, his constantly changing stories about what happened that night. The medical examiner's testimony. Doctor testified that Karen died from blunt force trauma to the head. The prosecution suggested she may have been strangled before being stomped, causing the complex fracture. There were no defensive wounds, suggesting she was attacked without warning, possibly while unconscious or asleep. Karen's lawyer also testified. He had filed Karen's divorce petition on her behalf, requesting half the house, primary custody of the children, child support, and a share of David's bonuses. Just weeks after that petition was filed, Karen went missing. Friends Bill and Kathy Bona testified about loaning Karen $2,000 and a spare phone so she could consult with a lawyer about the divorce. They said Karen wanted to leave David but didn't have the money. They also testified that David made them uncomfortable with his intrusive behavior, showing up uninvited, demanding to know where Karen was, insisting she come home. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial. There was no DNA, no murder weapon, no eyewitness. But Prosecutor Goodman argued that David Swift had the motive, rejection, divorce, losing control, the means, access to Karen while she slept, and the opportunity, the time window between 4:38 a.m. and 5:09 a.m. David Swift was furious the night Karen disappeared, Goodman told the jury. The defense's case, defense attorney Daniel Taylor painted a very different picture. His argument was simple. This case was built on suspicion, not evidence. Yes, David and Karen had a troubled marriage. Yes, David was upset about the divorce. Yes, he wanted to reconcile. But wanting to save your marriage doesn't make you a murderer. Taylor argued that David's attempts to reconcile should be seen as evidence of hope, not rage. Did David think maybe they could work it out again like they did the first time? Was he hopeful about that? Yes. The defense attacked the investigation itself. They questioned why police didn't look more closely at other people who had been around Karen. Her new social circle, the rumors about the Pink Poodle Club, the allegations of swinging and affairs. They pointed out that investigators threw away a diaper that apparently had blood in it before testing it. They suggested the investigation was rushed and tunnel-visioned on David from the beginning. The defense also called witnesses to testify about David's character. Family friend Kim Green said, "David is too kind of a person. He would not harm anybody." David's daughter Ashley remembered times her father helped strangers, like the time he paid for a struggling mother's groceries during the holidays so her kids could have a good Christmas. But perhaps most importantly, the defense hammered on the lack of forensic evidence. No DNA, no blood in David's car or home, no murder weapon, no witnesses, no confession, just theories and timelines and circumstantial connections. Taylor told the jury that the prosecution was asking them to convict David Swift based on what they thought happened, not on what they could prove happened. After a week of testimony, the case went to the jury on June 6, 2024. The jury deliberated for several hours. At one point, they sent a note to the judge saying they were deadlocked on one of the charges. Judge Hayes instructed them to continue deliberating. Finally, they reached a verdict. The jury found David Swift not guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, not guilty of attempted first-degree murder, not guilty of second-degree murder, not guilty of attempted second-degree murder. But on the fifth charge, voluntary manslaughter, the jury was hopelessly deadlocked. They could not reach a unanimous decision. Judge Hayes declared a mistrial on that charge alone. David Swift would not be retried on the murder charges. Double jeopardy attached, he was acquitted on those forever. But the voluntary manslaughter charge remained open. The community was divided. Some people believed justice had been served, that the prosecution simply didn't have enough evidence to prove David was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Others believed a murderer had walked free on a technicality. Karen's family was devastated. After 13 years of waiting, they still didn't have closure. On June 20th, 2024, just 2 weeks after the verdict, District Attorney Danny Goodman presented a new indictment to the grand jury for voluntary manslaughter. The indictment included specific language designed to pause the statute of limitations, allowing the state to retry David Swift on the charge for which the jury had been hung. David's defense team fought back. They filed motions to dismiss the case, arguing that retrying David on voluntary manslaughter after he had been acquitted on the murder charges violated his constitutional rights against double jeopardy. But in October 2024, the Tennessee Court of Appeals denied the defense's motion to dismiss. The court ruled that because the jury had been deadlocked, not acquitted on the voluntary manslaughter charge, the state could proceed with a second trial. A new trial date was set, May 7, 2025. But then, in March 2025, came another development. A judge dismissed the voluntary manslaughter charge on statute of limitations grounds. The prosecution had run out of time. District Attorney Goodman immediately announced his intent to appeal the dismissal. As of December 2025, David Swift's legal status remains in limbo. The voluntary manslaughter charge has been dismissed, but the DA is appealing. If the appeal succeeds, a second trial could still happen. If it fails, David Swift will never face trial for Karen's death again. Meanwhile, David still faces the felony stalking charge in Alabama related to his second ex-wife, Kelly Essman. That case remains pending. Karen's daughter Ashley has been caught in an impossible position. She loved both of her parents. She doesn't know what to believe. Ultimately, "I know my family's truth," she told 2020ths. "And I know my mom would want me to continue fighting for her." More than 13 years after Karen Swift vanished, her case remains legally unresolved, and there are so many questions that may never be answered. If David did it, how did he do it without leaving any forensic evidence? No blood in the house, no DNA in his vehicle, no murder weapon ever found. How did he clean up so thoroughly? How did he dispose of any evidence? If David didn't do it, then who did? Was it someone from Karen's new social circle? Was it related to the rumors about affairs and the Pink Poodle Club? Was it a random attack by a stranger? And if so, why was there no evidence of abduction or struggle? Why was Karen found partially clothed with her underwear pulled down? Was this staging to make it look like a sexual assault? Or was it something else? Why were both of her phones smashed and thrown away from the house? Who would benefit from destroying her phones? What messages or call logs were someone trying to hide? What happened during that window between 4:38 a.m. and 5:09 a.m.? That's the critical 31-minute period when everything changed. Karen's phones were active at 4:38 a.m. They left the house at 5:04 a.m. All activity stopped at 5:09 a.m. What happened in those 31 minutes? If Karen took a sleep aid, as prosecutors claimed, how did she end up leaving the house? Did someone wake her? Did someone carry her? Did she sleepwalk? The prosecution's theory requires accepting that David moved a sleeping or unconscious Karen from the bedroom to the garage without waking their daughter Ashley, without making any noise, without leaving any evidence. Is that possible? Maybe, but it requires a very specific sequence of events happening perfectly. And then there's the biggest question of all. Why did the jury acquit David on the murder charges but deadlock on voluntary manslaughter? Voluntary manslaughter typically applies to killings that occur in the heat of passion without premeditation. For example, if someone kills their spouse after catching them in bed with another person, the jury unanimously agreed David didn't commit premeditated murder or second-degree murder, but they couldn't agree on whether he killed Karen in a moment of uncontrolled rage. What does that tell us? Perhaps some jurors believed David did it but couldn't prove he planned it. Perhaps others believed he didn't do it at all. We may never know. Jury deliberations are confidential. Karen Johnson Swift was 44 years old when she died. She was a mother of 4, a personal trainer, an athlete, a friend. She loved running 5 Burmese chots. She loved teaching silver sneakers classes to older adults at the YMCA. She showed up to every one of her kids' games and competitions. Her boss, Randy Butler, said Karen did wonderful things for the community. Her friends described her as fun, energetic, the life of the party. Her daughter, Ashley, remembered a mother who was always there, always present, always devoted to her children. But in the months before her death, Karen was also a woman trying to find herself again, trying to reclaim her independence, trying to escape a marriage that had become suffocating. She filed for divorce. She went out with friends. She tried to build a life on her own terms. And then, on October 30th, 2011, after a Halloween party, after picking up her daughter from a sleepover, after arriving home in the early morning hours, Karen Swift disappeared. 6 weeks later, her body was found hidden beneath vines in an abandoned cemetery, her skull fractured from blunt force trauma. 13 years have passed. There has been an arrest, a trial, an acquittal, and a legal limbo. But there has been no final resolution. No one has been held accountable for Karen's death. No one has been sent to prison. The case technically remains open as an unsolved homicide. The town of Dyersburg, Tennessee, still carries this weight. Every Halloween, the community remembers Karen Swift. They remember the woman who vanished after the party. They remember the questions that were never answered. David Swift maintains his innocence. He has never confessed, never admitted to any involvement in Karen's death. His friends and family believe he is innocent, a kind man wrongly accused. His daughter Ashley is torn between the father she loves and the mother she lost. Karen's family continues to fight for justice. They believe someone knows what happened that night. They believe the truth will eventually come out. As District Attorney Danny Goodman said after the verdict, "This case isn't over. We're going to keep fighting for Karen." Whether that fight will result in a conviction, or whether Karen's death will remain forever unsolved, only time will tell. What we know for certain is this. On October 30th, 2011, a mother of 4 left a Halloween party and never came home. Someone killed her. Someone knows what happened. And somewhere out there, the truth is waiting to be uncovered. Rest in peace, Karen Swift. Your story deserves to be told. Your life deserves to be remembered. And your family deserves answers. If you have any information about the death of Karen Swift, please contact the Dyer County Sheriff's Office at 731-285-2802 or the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation at 1-800-TBI-FIND. Thank you for listening. Close your eyes and drift back to December 1956. Christmas lights still twinkled in windows across Chicago. The holiday season was winding down, and teenagers across America had one thing on their minds: Elvis Presley. His first movie, Love Me Tender, was playing in theaters everywhere. And for 2 sisters from Chicago's McKinley Park neighborhood, this movie had become an obsession. Barbara Grimes, 15, and Patricia P.D. Grimes, 12, had already seen it 11 times. But on the night of December 28, 1956, they begged their mother for one more trip to the Brighton Theater. Their mother, Loretta, said yes. The girls promised to be home by midnight. They never came home. Let yourself relax as I tell you the story of what happened after the movie ended. A mystery that has haunted Chicago for nearly 70 years. Barbara and Patricia were inseparable. Barbara was 15 and attended Thomas Kelly High School, while Patricia was 12 and went to St. Maurice's Catholic School. Friends described them as devoted students and good girls from a religious home. But more than anything, they loved Elvis. Both had recently joined his official fan club. They knew every word to every song. They had posters on their walls. And Love Me Tender had become their ritual. They'd seen it so many times they'd lost count. On December 28, 1956, the sisters left their home at approximately 7:30 p.m., bundled against the bitter Chicago winter. The Brighton Theater was only about 1.5 miles away. They likely took the bus, though no one knows for certain. Inside the theater, Patricia's school friend Dorothy Weinert sat behind the sisters during the screening. Dorothy and her sister left during intermission around 9:30 p.m., and she saw Barbara and Patricia waiting in line to buy popcorn. The girls seemed happy, relaxed, nothing unusual. That was the last confirmed sighting of the Grimes sisters alive. The movie ended around 11:15 p.m. Several witnesses reported seeing the girls board a bus heading east into the city on Archer Avenue. They allegedly got off the bus at Western Avenue at approximately 11:05 p.m., about halfway between the theater and their home. Why would they get off early? No one knows. Midnight came and went. Loretta Grimes grew worried. She sent her older daughter Teresa, 17, and son Joey, 14, to wait at the nearest bus stop. 3 buses passed. No Barbara, no Patricia. 2:15 a.m., Loretta reported them missing. Initially, police dismissed it. Runaways, they said. Maybe the girls went to Nashville to see Elvis in concert. But Loretta knew better. Her daughters would never do that. They were good girls, responsible. They had school after the holidays. As days turned into weeks, the search intensified. Hundreds of volunteers combed Chicago. Police went door to door. The Chicago Transit Authority reviewed records. Elvis himself made a public statement, pleading for the girls to come home if they'd run away. Tips poured in from across the Midwest. The sisters had been spotted at a five-and-dime store listening to Elvis records with 2 sailors. They'd been seen at restaurants, hotels, walking down streets with unknown men. Some said they'd gotten into a car with someone who looked like Elvis. But none of the sightings checked out. 25 agonizing days passed. On January 22, 1957, a man driving along German Church Road in Willow Springs, about 3 miles from the Grimes home, noticed something behind a guardrail. He stopped to investigate. The girls' nude bodies were discovered alongside a deserted road. Patricia lay on her back, with her body covering her sister's head. They had been hidden beneath vines and undergrowth, so well concealed that earlier searchers had likely passed right by. The girls' father, Joseph Grimes, was brought to the scene to identify them. It's impossible to imagine what that moment must have been like. Patricia had several minor puncture wounds in her chest, possibly made by an ice pick, and Barbara's face had marks and bruises. A preliminary autopsy indicated the girls died of exposure to freezing temperatures. But here's where the case becomes even more mysterious. The autopsy reports concluded they had been murdered within 5 hours of their last confirmed sighting, and both girls had died of secondary shock. This meant they likely died on December 28th, the same night they disappeared. Yet dozens of people swore they'd seen the girls alive in the weeks afterward. At stores, theaters, walking down streets. How could this be? The medical evidence contradicted the eyewitness accounts. Someone was wrong. But who? Police pursued every lead. One suspect was a young drifter from Tennessee named Edward Benny Bedwell. After several days in custody, Bedwell signed a confession on January 27, 1957, admitting he killed Barbara and Patricia with an accomplice named Frank. His story was elaborate. He claimed he met the girls at a tavern, spent a week with them at various hotels, and then killed them when they resisted his advances. Loretta Grimes vehemently denied her daughters would carouse with disreputable men, saying, "Our girls came from a good home and were brought up in religious surroundings." Almost immediately, Bedwell's confession fell apart. Medical experts concluded the girls died December 28, 1956, and Bedwell's factory time card provided an alibi for the night they disappeared. The confession was thrown out. Bedwell was released. Other suspects emerged over the years. Teenage boys who'd been seen following the girls. A man who resembled Elvis. Anonymous callers who claimed responsibility. But no one was ever charged. The Grimes sisters were buried together at Holy Sepulchre Catholic Cemetery on January 28, 1957. Their mother received the caskets closed. The girls had been exposed to the elements for too long. Nearly 70 years have passed since Barbara and Patricia Grimes left home to see their favorite movie one more time. The case remains officially unsolved, one of Chicago's most infamous cold cases. The murder of the Grimes sisters has been described by authors as a crime that shattered the innocence of Chicago. After their deaths, parents across the city held their children closer. The freedom of the 1950s, when kids could take buses to movies and walk home alone, suddenly felt dangerous. Who killed the Grimes sisters? Was it someone they knew? Someone they trusted enough to get into a car with? Or was it a stranger? A predator who saw two young girls alone on a cold December night? We may never know. What we do know is this: two sisters who loved Elvis Presley went to see his movie on a winter night in 1956. They bought popcorn during intermission. They smiled and laughed. And then they vanished into the Chicago night, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. Let this story drift away now, like snowflakes melting on a winter sidewalk. Rest peacefully, knowing their memory is preserved, their story told. Barbara and Patricia Grimes, two sisters who loved music, loved each other, and deserved so much more than the fate they received. Sleep well. Remember to subscribe and like the video to keep updated every night.